This right here is how I know that secretively I am actually a god, and that one day I will remember my divinity and ascend to the sky, at which point I will rain holy fire down upon everyone I've ever disliked. Because just yesterday, I made the point that with the recent Wraithbone changes, GW is stealing the magic out of 40k. They are taking away its fantasy elements because it's been infested with progressivism, an ideology that hates and rejects fantasy and wants to push the real world into it at any cost. And then we get Magic the Gathering lead designer says trans women, people of color and women playing a large role are all parts of modern fantasy because they're all part of the actual world. There you go. It's always nice to have an example within the 24 hours of making a point now, isn't it? Again, see, progressivism is a reductivist ideology. It is deconstructivist at its very core. It cannot abide by the magical or the amazing or the fantastical. It must always denigrate and reduce these elements to simply just today and people. They are incapable of doing anything else, to the point where the first guy here is like, I want to hear stories of fairies, kithkins, elves, goblins, and giant folks, merfolk and cinders, fantasy creatures. And the Magic the Gathering guy going, actually, politics, you privileged shit. Imagine wanting to hear stories about fantasy creatures in a fantasy setting. What a bigot. Alright, let's read it, shall we? Mark Rosewater replies to problematic questions around Magic the Gathering on his Tumblr blog. Of course he does. It's been a while since I've seen problematic be used unironically. Last week, Magic the Gathering's lead designer, Mark Rosewater, made a point to respond to two particularly problematic questions submitted to his blog. In his replies, he defends marginalized communities. Those who have the designers of enormous corporations defending them. The marginalized people, including trans people of color, and women. Ah, yes, women. 4% of the population, and more privileged than the majority of the male grouping? Those darn discriminated against females. Particularly here in the Western world, they have it rough, what can I say? Speaking out against prejudice, and further cementing his position that Magic the Gathering is a hobby meant for all kinds of people to enjoy. So long as you're not a filthy, dirty white male who wants fantasy in his fantasy, of course. Those people are bigoted. In the first question, which Rosewater posted an answer to on February 6th, the questioner makes it clear they are concerned that the upcoming law and set will be fucked up by some art style they don't enjoy, and the real-world politics agenda not so subtly pushed in later sets. It goes on to note that we want to see, as if speaking for all the Magic the Gathering fans, stories of fairies, kithkin, elves, goblins, giants, merfolks, and cinders in their beautiful fantasy setting. No trans they-them fairies that think they're kitkins. Oh yes, that is definitely not the opinion of the majority of the Magic the Gathering community. Why would they ever want fantasy creatures in a fantasy setting? Absurd. In Rosewater's response, he states that for far too long, fantasy as a genre was used as a way to reflect the worldview of those in power. It leaned into stereotypes and reflected how the privileged wished the world was. Ah yes, I recollected well when all we whites came together. In Washington, for example, the political elite were like, gosh darn it, I wish the orcs would get back in the fields, or those elves stop being so snooty, and don't get me started on the lizard folk. Yeah, that's definitely reflective of real-world reality, no doubt about it. No. Fantasy was not a genre used to reflect the worldview of those in power. It really wasn't. In fact, it was the exact opposite. It wasn't a way to escape the real world. Unless, of course, you mean reflect the power those in power actually in power. Now, then you're correct. Because fantasy right now is being used to reflect the worldview of progressives who are in charge of Magic the Gathering. That's why you can't have any giants or merfolk, but you will be given they-thems who think they're kithkins. He goes on to explain that modern fantasy doesn't look like fantasy back in its youth. Oh god, is that correct? Because it responds to a changing world and has to capture a variety of lived experiences, as opposed to constantly revisiting and reaffirming the same old worldview. Exactly. We can't do the fantasy stuff. What do you want? Fantasy? Old school stuff? Wizards and goblins? God no. We've got lived experiences of Ruth, the black woman, to tell you. Trans people, people of color, and women playing a larger role are all part of modern fantasy because they're all part of the actual world. And it's important that our stories and world building be reflective of that. No fantasy allowed in your fantasy. He ends with a note of hope that in that entertainment is at its best when it lifts everyone up and isn't used as yet another means to ignore certain people's reality. Fantasy is at its best when it lifts everybody up by ignoring everyone's reality. Tolkien wasn't making a particularly salient commentary on the left-right divide when he was making Lord of the Rings. Even the most optimistic political interpretations of Tolkien, which would be like fighting against the Huns, is at worst good versus evil, unmutable evil in the way of Sauron. Which, I mean, I suppose you could call it political commentary that the people of Gondor don't want to get genocided, but I don't know if I'd go quite so far. The second post Rosewater deigned to respond to, he posed on Sunday, with a much more comprehensive dive into the subject. This time, the questioner seems to have taken issue with Magic the Gathering's push towards DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. They refer specifically to Captain Cissé, a character who is both black and a woman. I fear if you did it over again, Gerard would be trans, black, and disabled, just because it also cheapens the stories of world devastation when characters worry more about their gender than Bolas destroying everything. I mean, yeah, your gender is not necessarily very relevant in the case of a world-ending disaster. In his reply, Rosewater notes that even the term push seems to imply it's unnaturally here, that we are forcing something that naturally shouldn't be. Correct. Well, you have, I don't know about the black woman part? No, perhaps not. I don't know enough about Magic the Gathering, honestly, to say, but I'm presuming there's black people in it, so perhaps not. But the whole trans people, etc.? Yeah, no. In a world where you could change your gender at will, and disability, where again you could snap your fingers at a certain level and fix that, yeah, that would be pushing it. That would not be naturally occurring. You can almost hear his knuckles crack and the shuffle toward the keyboard. Shuffle towards the keyboard. Spent what Commons noticed was a little over an hour since last pod composing his careful response. Imagine if every time you turned on the TV or watched a movie, no one looked like you. Yeah, that's never really been the case. He begins resonating with the sadness that comes from the lack of positive representation as a Jewish citizen of the US. You just feel invisible and like an outsider. Really? Really now? Rosewater clearly recognizes his privilege, admits, I don't think we did justice to Cissé as a character. Neither Michael nor I have any knowledge of what it's like to be a black woman, nor did we ever talk to someone who did. So you did push it then. So, hold on. Who asked you for this then? What was the impetus for this? Beyond, well, the feel of invisibility like an outsider, the political side of things. If you didn't even talk to somebody who was a black woman, who wanted this, does that mean you just talked to all of your other fellow whites and went like, hey, we gotta have a black woman in this? Because that's weird. He goes on to urge people to consider what it may be like to have a movie made of your life, one that's not representative of your life in any way, shape or form other than showing your likeness. In putting that movie out into the world, people might assume that was what you were like, because, you know, they'd seen the movie. Hello, Norwegian here. Have you seen Vikings in any movie ever? Hell, even the Vikings TV show has a black Viking chieftain in it. Yeah, I think I get what you're meaning, but the thing is, that's not a question about fantasy, even now, is it? It's a question about a political ideology forcing its way into the fantasy. The reason why we have a black female chief in Norway isn't because it was historical, it was because it's representation. I don't really care about that in the same way that I wouldn't like to see a white guy in the Zulu armies. Exact same thing. That's what misrepresenting people does. It not only makes them feel not seen, it falsely represents them, spreading lies, often stereotypes, making people believe things about them that aren't true. Well, you should be deeply ashamed of yourself, shouldn't you, Rosewater? Deeply ashamed of yourself. It is obvious this is something Rosewater feels very strong about. To hammer the point home, he quotes, "When you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression." By the way, you're on Tumblr, right? Not on Twitter? You're on Tumblr, a very left-wing leaning platform. I do wonder if the true meaning of that saying hasn't somewhat flown over your head here, Mr. Rosewater. Making clear that nothing is being taken away from Magic the Gathering plays by an increase in diversity. Of course it is. It inevitably will. Here's the thing. You only have so many cards. You only have so many stories to tell. Every time you could go, okay, we're gonna add in a fantasy character here. We're gonna add in a fairy, a mermaid, a giant, or whatever else, and instead you go, no, Californian. That is indeed something being taken away from the setting. Enforcing modernity upon a fantasy setting is in and of itself reducing it. You are not, again, throughout this entire thing, at no point did he go, oh, well, we did this because this was the best for the setting. We did this because this character made a lot of sense in the setting. We did this because it feels fantastical. That is never the argument throughout all of this. The argument is real world. In the real world, this is a thing, and therefore, in our fantasy, this must be a real thing. This is absolutely, by definition, you taking something away from the fantasy by replacing it with the real world. And the fact that you can't even see that is very demonstrative of the problem I talked about in yesterday's video with 40k. These people don't think that they're being actively malicious. They don't believe that they're ruining the setting by doing this. They simply have such a thoroughly indoctrinated political belief that they cannot recognize when they are reducing the setting because they never valued that. To them, taking fantasy out of fantasy is not lessening it because they never cared about the fantasy at all. Whereas adding diversity is something they do care deeply about, and thus, if anything, it's adding to the setting you see. It only feels that way because of their privilege. He also believes that having better sense of the rest of the world comes with a lot of benefits. Ah yes. You only feel that your magic is taken away from you when they make magic less fantastical because you're privileged, says Magic the Gathering's lead designer. You're just privileged, bro. That's why I am going to enforce my worldview upon you from my golden throne. It's just your privilege, bro. Says Mr. Rosewater. Well, I could hardly ask for a better example than this, couldn't I? I think we're gonna have to squirrel this one away into the archives, because God, this is perfect. Absolutely perfect. And remember what I said at the end of the 40k video as well. The only way you can have your fantasy back is by calling this out. By pointing out that they are reducing the magic, and by, well, simply not engaging with it. Your fantasy setting doesn't have any fantasy in it anymore? Don't buy it. Simple as that. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.